if you think about it, automotive has always been mobile. It is, the ultimate mobile device if you think about it. And who better to talk about the intersection of mobile and auto than Duncan McCall, who is the CEO of PlaceIQ, one of the leaders when it comes to mobile geolocation and really trying to understand the consumer on the go. So let's turn it over to Duncan. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Appreciate you having us here. So I think we've got a pretty interesting topic, as Stephen kicked off there, to talk about. So as he said, my name's Duncan McCall. I'm co-founder and CEO of a company called PlaceIQ. I'm going to introduce these folks in a moment, but I'm going to tell you first, what we're not going to talk about here. We're not going to talk about this construct that, hey, mobile's important and it's a new channel and it's a medium, and I'm not going to quote a whole bunch of stats at you. What we're going to talk about is this idea that mobile is this horizontal enabling infrastructure now. And in some ways we're just getting started, and in some ways it's already becoming incredibly advanced. You all know that the mobile device is an incredibly powerful sensor that so many of us have with us all the time. So what we want to talk about here is how this new evolving opportunity of mobile goes beyond some of the traditional use cases and really enables incredibly sophisticated thinking, the ability to bind together new channels, the ability to surface completely new insights, the ability to serve as a new type of attribution mechanism. That's the kind of stuff we're going to focus on. So with that, I want to introduce the panelists here. And going to my right, Scott Peters, who was a VP and media director at 22 Squared, who spends a lot of time working on Toyota. To his right is Thomas Choi, SVP and digital director at MediaVest, who of course spends an awful amount of time on Honda, and you've heard from Honda already today, a very interesting talk. And then Chris Goggins, who is the SVP and GM at DataLogix, DLX platform. DataLogix, as I'm sure you're all aware, now becoming part of Oracle. And then to his right, Albert Thompson, digital strategist, Walter Isaacson, who spends a lot of time on Lexus as well as other brands. So with that, what I want to do is the first topic I really want to touch on is everybody understands this idea in advertising that now mobile has all these new capabilities. And of course, one of them is location, the fact that these mobile devices are location aware, people are sharing location. And of course, one of the first use cases for automotive was, hey, if you've got location's key for automotive because you've got these automotive dealerships, and now we can geo-conquest, and that, as we all know, that's bottom of the funnel, it has limited scale. We don't want to talk about geo-conquesting. We want to talk about really interesting advanced use cases beyond that. So starting to think about the idea of, how can auto brands use mobile to better understand consumers? How can they use mobile to actually inform them about data that can be applied outside of, the marketing ecosystem? And I want to start with maybe Thomas and talk about, in your experience, what you're doing now, what you're focusing on. How do you see this moving beyond geo-conquesting and enabling all these sort of rich new applications?
Yeah. So I think there's tremendous opportunity when you look at this consumer intelligence that's available to us, and looking at it from the standpoint of just think about planning and using that intelligence upstream. So, when we talk about location-based things, it's real-world behavior. And how can we use that from a planning perspective? I think, the theme throughout, obviously, this conference is about programmatic, but we still have to do some planning up front. And I think there's some really, really valuable information that can be used upstream. And then in addition to that, I think, if you go a little bit further downstream, there's a whole idea that things that are location-based can also represent some very meaningful KPIs that, certainly we want to measure everything back down to sales and as well as brand lifts and things like that. But understanding how the things that we do ultimately influence real-world behavior, I think that can be a very rich KPI.
Great. So Chris, from your perspective, DataLogix, obviously an incredibly data-rich company, and the IHS Polk data. Yeah. How do you see this? What are your thoughts on these advanced use cases?
Yeah, so it's interesting. When we started DataLogix, we actually went after a signal of, to use your term, Thomas, real-world behavior, which is purchasing. We thought, okay, if you can really understand how people spend their money, you can't spoof that, you can't fake that. You're voting with your dollars, so it's like just truth. Yeah. And so mobile, and the way we think about it, is just the next vector of truth. If you think as a consumer, you really have your time and your money. So money is what you spend, time is where you go, and those are two incredibly powerful signals. So looking at how mobile helps you collect real-world signals on where people go can then be applied to that person, especially if you think about identity and cross-device, which we'll get into, in a really powerful way, just as kind of purchasing and other kind of real-world behaviors have ahead of it.
Right. So Scott, in your experience, when you think about sort of building on this, right, this idea of mobile informing us about consumers and about their different types of behavior, evolving audience personas, breaking down some norms of what we thought was true. Any sort of interesting thoughts or case studies that you've come across?
Yeah, I think, I represent tier 2, so we've got a tough job because, to Thomas's point, we're interested in upstream insights as well as downstream insights, sending people to dealers. So from an upstream standpoint, I mean, the mobile device can tell you so much about a person, and if you can read that properly, you can understand a lot about them. And then from a downstream standpoint, we've done a lot of learning about how people are using mobile in the shopping process before they get to the lot. To your point, by the time they've gotten to the lot, it's too late. You need to use mobile to get them before that to influence shopping. So things that aren't counterintuitive now, but were then, they still want to call a dealer. So are your dealers ready to take the call? They're doing deep shopping. They're doing endemic website type depth of shopping on mobile devices. So are you there? Et cetera. And I think with the future, with location data, it's going to be, how are people cross-shopping? Where are people going before they go to your dealership? How long are they staying at your dealership? And things like that are going to enable us to educate dealers and help the experience at a tier 3 level eventually.
Great. And Albert, in your experience, again, when you think about, hey, what orthogonal learnings have you uncovered? What stuff has kind of informed you that you say, hey, this is new. My existing sort of channels weren't telling me this.
Right.
Any thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of our challenge is we're looking at 3 segments at the tier 2 level at the same time: Black, Hispanic, and those amongst the LGBT community. So we know that their point of origin isn't unified. There's some differentiation. So for us, we have to go back upstream, looking at where we got them before they came down to the funnel, and do those patterns, behaviors, places of origin match up against what we strategically thought were the norms. We also do national level. So the major things we do from a national advertising perspective, now that we start to break apart the data at the DMA level by segment, do those correlate? In other words, is there a mismatch between our national thinking and an overlay between what people are actually doing in market? So that's what we're starting to do with our data partners, is have them sort of map back. Where do they start? What are the content points of interest? And then ultimately get into the physical places of interest. And beyond that, guiding what we do at the tier 2 level in a given DMA, we would take that intelligence back to the national level strategy and say, do we need to rethink who we thought this audience was because we have data? So when you say the human truth is in what you do, i.e. where you go, I mean, that couldn't be more powerful. So when you start to think about the affluent nature of somebody Black, Hispanic, or in the gay community, there's always sometimes a misnomer: will they spend on luxury goods? But when you can start to map back points of origin, where they went, what they're doing, you can actually validate that before they even come downstream. So, I think to Thomas's comment earlier, you start to look at this as really a planning ecosystem, an infrastructure, and then how that changes the entire sort of business approach for all the, the 3 segments or whatever segment you're serving. So yeah, I mean, that's where we see mobile. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of optimism in it peeling back more layers and who the consumer sort of really is than what we knew with some of the standard data sets you relied on historically.
Yeah, I think a lot of times when you talk about data, you automatically default to thinking about it strictly from a programmatic perspective, right? And again, just going back to the whole idea that we have to do a lot of planning. Well, part of that planning also involves maybe using some interesting data sets to be able to do some predictive analysis. What can search tell us? What can real world behavior tell us? So I think there's a lot of value in that worth exploring further.
That's a great point, right? I think, this idea that when you think about advertising and data or data, you think about this idea of, well, that's data that we layer upon and we do better targeting with. We don't necessarily think about the learnings and the insights. And those two previous points, remind me of a case study that really quickly, not to name any brands, we were working with a luxury import automaker and running various campaigns, and we were looking at the real-world behaviors of people who recently visited their dealerships, and then we could see the other dealerships they had visited in the 30-day period. Yeah. So essentially the cross-shopping habits of these consumers, and we saw something that initially we thought, well, this is a mistake. We saw that you had the usual luxury suspects, and then something that really popped was a Korean import brand. These people were going from this luxury car dealership to a Korean import brand, and then we said, well, that's interesting. And then suddenly you realize this Korean import brand had a bunch of luxury cars, and they'd be conquesting this other brand. And now suddenly we took this to the client. It was a fascinating conversation, and they said, well, can you tease apart, and can you tell me the people that you see going from our dealerships to this other brand, are they our luxury people or our mid-level or entry-level? And we found out that it was actually the luxury people. So suddenly, like, my goodness, we've really learned now that absolutely this other vehicle is in the consideration set with our luxury vehicles. And that's you don't think of that as the idea of just data. That's insights and learnings, and you can then take that data back, and now you can make smarter decisions, and you can conquest, and you can target people more effectively. So, I think the other piece that always I find staggering, right? You think of automotive, and automotive is such a rich contextual medium in terms of there's 1,000 different reasons people buy vehicles, right? Style, luxury, performance, whatever it may be, and there's so many amenities around vehicles, right? In-car entertainment, off-road ability, and there's so many data signals out there to enable folks like yourself to be able to understand how to speak to these different elements and messaging and all the sorts of components we all dream about, which is really relevant contextual one-to-one marketing. And yet, as we all know, where the rubber meets the road is in the creative, right? The actual creative that the consumer sees. They don't see data and targeting, they see creative. And it has always sort of partially fascinated and frustrated me that why can't we get better creative? We have these amazing opportunities now to be able to build these data sides up, and yet the creative still lags. I'd love to hear thoughts from the panel as to why that is. What are your experiences? Why do you think we're at this stage?
Yeah, I'll take the first nod on it. I think we had talked about it. When you think about mobile and technology, it's not about creative for sake of graphics or art or production. It's about design. I mean, you have to design the human experience, for which creative art, production, TV spots, whatever you're reskinning, is merely just one aspect of all the things that have to come together. I mean, you have to think about interaction design. You have to think about someone's behaviors on a smartwatch versus a smartphone versus a tablet versus a desktop versus a smart TV. It's not the same. Obviously, our complexity is added when you have different segments who like to do different things with different devices or have a higher propensity for one versus the other. So you have to start to rethink this notion of someone coming into a dealership with a smartwatch that pings the service manager that they're about to arrive, and they come out with a tablet and greet them and log them in with their vehicle, and then they send them notifications when their car is ready. I mean, that's a completely different way of looking at this notion of mobility versus just mobile as a channel. So yeah, you need interaction designers, you need human experience designers, and you need creative, and then you need the technology people. So it's a continuum that's probably a bit overwhelming for what has typically been the model for advertising in terms of actual interaction with whatever the creative execution was presented at sort of the point of contact. You don't really interact with the print ad per se. You can some. Same thing with TV spot. Nobody really wants to interact with the banner ad. So you have to think about designing for these environments, the context for which you reach them, and what people are really willing to do on a screen that's 2 inches versus one that's 4 inches versus one that's 50 inches.
I would build off that. I think a challenge we see in the business is that we're still mentally kind of living in the desktop world. We're so comfortable with desktop advertising. Hooray, we got there. But mobile's so omnipresent, and you can't have a desktop mentality in the mobile world. I mean, the data's great. We can find people on this device that they love, and they're so engaged in the content, but then we give them a crappy banner ad. That's the desktop way.
Right.
And the solve isn't necessarily to give them a bigger, shinier banner ad. You know, if you think about what people are doing, I mean, the thumb is moving. It's the news feed with all these deeply personal, you know, stories in their lives. You know, it's baby, it's food, it's my kids. I gotta like that, so my wife likes that. It's my ex-girlfriend, I'm more successful than she is, and that's great. More babies, more food, more dogs, cats, videos. I love all that stuff, and then it's a Corolla. And what am I going to show people about a Corolla? And that's a question. It's a tough question. What am I going to show people about a Corolla that will get them their thumb to stop and them to look at it and to want to learn more and spend more time with us? And I think if you can master that, you will learn so much about how to be relevant to people. So I think the notion of the data feedback cycle is really important.
That's why that's why the audience piece is so hard, because there's really only a few people that will engage with the Corolla ad.
Right.
So how do you get to those people without whatever data set you're using? I actually think mobile is going to be transformative for programmatic. Like desktop obviously programmatic started in desktop, but like we haven't seen anything yet. Like programmatic is going to explode, because you have persistence of ID, you have incredible data richness, all the same behavioral and offline data you have on desktop plus location. You have an identity layer, so you have where you don't have to worry about it. Cookie deletion. Fraud is really hard to do in mobile. It's hard to spoof a lat long. It's hard to spoof mobile IDs relative to cookies. Like it's going to be, in 3 years, like game changing.
Yeah, I think certainly the technology and the mechanics are there. I think what's lacking is, to Albert's point, the resources and the proper allocation of those resources. And I think there's also issues as it relates to mindset. I think, you know, I'm a media guy, but I guess I'm a pretty good storyteller, or my 5-year-old at least likes to think so. So I guess I can speak to creative, but I like to think of creative and experiences as some kind of a value exchange. Bob Pittman talked about how, you know, as we partner with, you know, with media companies and channels, that we're kind of borrowing, right, their customer relation. And so are we delivering something that is of value to the customer that they actually want to engage with or play around with, you know? So I think it's really a shift in mindset in terms of, instead of just pushing out our messaging that we think that they want to, you know, hear more about, it's really understanding what's valuable to them.
You know, one of the examples I always give is, you know, we were working with a brand, and we're just scraping the surface, but this was, you know, one of the things that gave me a glimmer of hope. And we said, look, there's a whole ton of reasons that people might be interested in your vehicle. And this was, you know, for a minivan campaign. So you look at minivan owners, and we worked with, you know, with DataLogix and ISH Polk, and we looked at all the people that own minivans, were in market for minivans, and then we said, let's look at their anonymous behaviors. What are the things they physically do in the world? And we bucketed them not into 1,000 things, but into sort of I think it was 16 or 18 different types of behaviors, and this was last summer, and one of them was they have visited the beach recently. So suddenly, instead of just saying, you know, like we used to see this at the beginning, we do all this great targeting, and then there's a banner ad that's just agnostic across it all, we actually said, let's build a creative that is specific to that one group. So this is people that own a minivan, they're in market for a minivan, they've recently been to the beach. We showed them a mobile creative that had a very subtle beach-style background, but in the creative, we called out the messaging of the fact that, hey, this new type of you know, minivan has a built-in, you know, vacuum cleaner in it. So now you're imagining you've been to the beach, you've got kids because you own a minivan, you're in market for a minivan. The kids have trashed the back of the minivan for the 15th time, there's sand everywhere, and you're now getting an ad talking about the fact that the new model minivan has a built-in vacuum cleaner. That to me is really starting to scratch at the surface of this idea of that's semi-contextual, relevant advertising, right? And that to me is, you know, the beginning of this stuff. And I think, you know, to the points you guys have made there, which is, you know, I like the Corolla analogy, and how do you stop and get people to click? And unfortunately, right, because we had this gap of attribution, one of the KPIs that the industry grew up with was CTR, click, how many people clicked on an ad. And because there was this huge gap, that was the KPI to sort of to really push towards, and I think that created a ton of bad experiences for consumers because you end up with interruptive advertising in the absence of anything else. So you think about this, right, and you think about attribution. So the next topic I want to talk about is attribution. And I was in Austin yesterday for the 4As, and it's like everybody is talking about attribution nonstop now. There's the measurement, analytics, and attribution. It's become the new programmatic, right? Everyone's talking about it. You think of Google and AOL and their acquisitions into the attribution space. So let's talk about automotive and attribution. And to kick off, one of the quick things I want to talk about is something we've done, right? Because we suffered with this exact issue of how do you tie this stuff to freaking car sales? Like Tom said earlier from Honda, I got to sell cars here, and I can do a million different things, but I got to be able to measure, did I sell cars? So we worked with DataLogix and IHS Polk to say, look, we see all of these devices on automotive dealerships, and everybody talks about that, but I can imagine for the brands and advertisers in the audience, like, is that real? Is it really there? Is this stuff real? There's a lot of claiming. So we said, no, we're going to prove that these people have a connection to attribution of bought vehicles. So we worked with these guys, and we looked for basically last year all the devices we saw on the physical polygons of automotive dealerships, and we tied it to registration data, and we said how many people physically bought a vehicle. And we haven't announced this yet, so this is literally hot off the presses, and it's kind of internal right now. But we basically found out that we saw that people that we saw on a brand dealership were 550%, 5.5 times more likely, more frequently buying that actual vehicle. People that we saw in general were 3.5, on automotive dealerships, 3.5 times more frequently buying cars. And the intent signal was somewhere, I think, just slightly above the in-market signal. So suddenly, even though it's an early study, you have this direct connection between what effectively is a new mid-funnel KPI, right? You've got leads, you've got sales. Now we've got this mid-funnel KPI that the mobile device enables as a sensor. So if you think about that, that's just the beginning, right? That's just the start. You think about this challenge and opportunity in mobile as attribution, and how does mobile help, and where are we with that? I'd love to hear, your guys' thoughts. So how do you think about attribution, and how does mobile fit into this like omni-channel strategy? Thoughts on that?
Well, I mean,
We all looked at you,
yeah,
so you
yeah,
had to go
that's
first.
the measure.
It's the attribution guy with the data, right?
So I'll go back to what I said earlier. I think you'd measure things only humans can do. They can buy stuff and they can go places, or like two really good ways to measure things. Like, I just spent $1 million on a campaign, what actually happened? There's some other things that happen along the way, but if you drive people to focus on clicks, you create massive perverse incentives for bad actors that's not very hard to do to game that system. So you create a system that can't be gamed, right? It's extremely hard to, if you get the right metrics in line, and it's a little bit harder to do. We're still getting there as an industry, but this is now a solvable problem, and this is why I think personally mobile is going to completely transform and jumpstart programmatic in a way that we're not even there yet, because now you can actually measure these things in a way that's much more real.
I think, though, that there's still a lot of work to be done. I mean, when we talk about attribution and the successes that can be had, a lot of it is isolated to specific campaigns or channels, and you don't have a comprehensive view yet. So we need whatever, like a persistent ID, unified ID, whatever you want to call it, I think, that connects all the pieces together. That way, we know all the factors that went into actually contributing towards a sale, rather than just attributing it to one single point of contact or touch point.
You can't look at them in vacuums, in silos,
exactly.
basically.
Yeah, I think, if you get to the human truth of how people buy a car, what are the triggers, rationally, emotionally? There are a lot of things that we do that will fall to the wayside. So when you talk about the human truth about what they do with their time, what they do with their money, as leading indicators, you want to understand attitudes and beliefs, but at the end of the day, you got to get down to quote unquote actions. If the average person makes a decision about a brand based upon, let's say, 20 inflection points between word of mouth conversation, between seeing a car valet, between their neighbor brought it home, between seeing it on the roadway speed by them, between doing some level of shopping, maybe clicking on a banner, seeing it in a print ad, I mean, when you start to look at it, that's the construct of what it takes to develop and mold brand affinity, which is a nice way of saying you probably need to have some presence in a lot of things. I think you can use attribution to help optimize what is a more effective spend, where you should concentrate more of your dollars, but there are probably a lot of things you still need to stay with anyway. So it's futile to get in and say, oh, it's search that's killing it. And it's like, no, we don't buy cars based on search. There are many things that happen impression-wise that could have happened decades before, or something our parents taught us about, son, when you get older, this is what you go get. It have nothing to do with the keyword in a box. So when you start to think about that, people have to get down to the basic level of what are the triggers for people buying a car. Focus on, again, you could say, measure what against what people do. There are certain areas of advertising, marketing, promotion you should be in because it is an inflection point that does count. But start to look at attribution as a way to optimize the more effective level of your spend versus giving it credit to, one particular tactic in a given channel and deciding to cut stuff out altogether. Now, granted, there are things you can do that are frivolous and perhaps a waste of time, but that gets to a brand identity. Know where your brand can win, know its limitations, and know what you probably have no business doing anyways. And I think what we see is we see brands do stuff, and we probably look at it and say, okay, that's not that brand. Like, I know what brand that is, who should be there, but not them. So I think when you get into the plannings and insights, you dig into that, you'll help find, a brand will figure out places they probably shouldn't be playing anymore to get to better places that just make more business sense based on who they essentially are. So I think when you say mobile is going to be transformative, I think from a brand identity perspective, really knowing what you are selling and who your real customer is, mobile is going to change that because there'll be concrete data that's undeniable, that can't be argued, that is a better telling story than what we've looked at for the past century, essentially.
So, how do you guys think about the future? So let's imagine we fast forward to this magical future, right, whereby the entire media mix is measurable, and you've got a universal cookie that's horizontal, and that's going to happen, right, theoretically, and then we'll have toasters and fridges, and we'll have to figure out how to pull those in. But let's just, hypothetically say that. What happens when everything becomes measurable, right? So every single dollar you can spend gets keyed to ROI. What happens with branding and building a halo effect and having kids growing up want to drive Porsches or Lamborghinis? How do you think about the future when this stuff, everything is measurable? How do you separate out what is branding from I'm only spending this money if it ends up selling a car? How do you think about that?
I think branding needs to be a part of that measurable construct. I mean, we're talking
survey people, or
well, no. I mean, we're kind of yes, from a tech standpoint, from a pure media standpoint, multi-channel attribution may someday be possible, but then you have to apply it to the auto industry, and that's going to be another whole set of hurdles. I mean, you're talking about even without what people liked when they were kids, you're talking about a purchase process that takes years.
Yep.
So my television TRPs from 2 years ago had an impact on someone's mind that's buying a car tomorrow.
Yep.
You need that context. You absolutely need that context, or at least you need to know when to draw the boundaries of when you're going to backcast to eliminate some of that. It's going to be a challenge. I think it was described this morning as an immense journey. I think that we're all on towards this vision, and I think we all need to hold hands and push ourselves, push partners towards the vision. But I think the reality is it's going to take time, and it's never going to be perfect.
Yeah.
It's never going to be the holy grail, but it can be better than what we've got today.
Yeah. So, one of my favorite attribution stories in auto, that happened to us was we were working with a unnamed automotive group, and we sort of configured the campaign, and hey, we had all the KPIs we thought, and then suddenly they call us up halfway through the campaign, and they say, you guys aren't meeting our internal KPIs. And we said, well, we didn't know what your internal KPIs were because you didn't tell us. What are they? And they said, we don't see enough click-to-map activity. Well, you've never told us about this click-to-map activity. No, we don't see enough click-to-map activity. So we looked at the campaign, and the campaign was retargeting people who had been to their dealership, who had no reason to click to map to go back to the dealership. And at that point, you would think, well, they would say, oh, yeah, sorry. They said, no, you're not meeting our internal KPI. And I said, just to be clear, this campaign is targeting people who've just been to your dealership. Why would I try and get them to open a map of the place they just went? Doesn't matter. you guys are getting optimized out. And at that point, I'm like, we got a long way to go with this whole idea of attribution and measurement and getting beyond the traditional KPIs.
It's an interesting story you tell, because when you think about really bringing this home, and if you had to take a lesson from the sharper marketing innovation, it's going to end up at the retail level. The brand is going to have to set the foundation for really understanding. So in this case in point, if they understood what retargeting was about, and that's at a basic level, you wouldn't even had to answer the phone for that conversation. But when we think about automotive, we have to think about the infrastructure of like the dealership experience, and that catching up to what we in the publisher, tech, and agency community are trying to push. We can only bring it so far without them helping drive this, essentially. So, fashion houses are there, and you can see it from clothing retailers. They're already, they're already experimenting with, touchscreens and mannequins and click to order, and the automotive space isn't as advanced because they've never had to work this hard to make the money that was coming easier to them, decades ago. So, if we had to look at probably one universal hurdle, it's our brands getting on the same innovation path that we're on and investing in the infrastructure that supports the insights that mobile will teach us. Because at some point, it's going to come back to them, because we're going to say, we got all this new data. How are we going to put it in action? Because you don't have the infrastructure or the technology to really capitalize on it. We can keep doing it on our end, but it's only going to take it so far.
So to build on a couple of things you guys are getting at there in terms of the universal cookie, the evolution of data, I often think about this idea, again, sort of approaching this. I'm not an expert in this vertical, but when I've spent some time talking to the big OEMs, and I look at the internalized IT systems they have, right? And it's just I saw this schematic, just mind-boggling. Thousands of systems worldwide. God only knows, they don't even know what half of them do. Some of them are scraping green screens, and they have not, they're a trillion miles away from having a unified view of the consumer, and they're spending money here, they're duplicating it here, they don't know what they're doing here. But the good news is they're building for the future. And I often think about this idea of, you have this traditional construct of a CRM system, right? And you have this new construct now of a DMP. And there's some people who are just charging into that world and are already there, and obviously Oracle being now an owner of a DMP, and Nielsen having one, and the DMP space is a fascinating construct. You think about it as it pertains to automotive. Where does this go? When you see the automotive industry, talk to clients, etc., about a CRM versus DMP, how does it enable? How should they think about it? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think it starts with breaking down some departmental walls, right? And helping whatever discipline is involved understand that they're really a stakeholder, right? As it relates to some kind of a centralized DMP solution, that there's value for them there. It could be CRM, it could be, side people that have to understand how it informs a content management system that they may want to, build. So I think it really starts on more of the marketer side, and just, again, breaking down some of those walls and having them understand that it's more than just a media tool or a marketing tool, that it could be enterprise-wide.
Where is the thinking? Like, when you have those conversations, where is everybody, right, we're ready, we want a DMP strategy, like, what the hell does DMP mean? Where are they?
That's a lot of times.
We're on the spectrum.
How much is this going to cost?
Yeah.
But some of it is we've, as an industry, created all these acronyms to, I don't know why, but we confuse things. Like, a DMP is just a CRM system for the digital age. It's no different. I actually started my career in BI and data warehousing 20 years ago in enterprise software. It's the same thing. It's just what business question or business objective are you trying to answer, and then what data do you better make sure you're asking the right question, which is 90% of the battle. Am I actually focused on the right thing? And then aggregating the data to answer that question. And so I think we confuse it. We make it more complicated than it needs to be. And so unfortunately, we spend a lot of time as an industry explaining what all these terms mean, rather than why should you care? And so I think that's on us to fix, actually.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is we have to get beyond the point of there's too much thinking that it's a transactional relationship. So a lot of it is from the brand perspective, from the retail perspective, from the technology perspective, it's just a transactional relationship. The one thing that Facebook taught us is that, especially for brands, people need to get along before they go along. So the human element is just missing in that conversation. And we don't do justice by layering it in with a whole bunch of acronyms that just confuses people. But if you bring that back into it, that you have to connect with people, and mobile is the ultimate connector. So it's going to force many hands, and there are going to be plenty of winners, but there are going to be a lot of losers essentially as well. Then we can start to get to rethinking the models that essentially have been in place. The technology is great. At the retail level, they feel like they have a handle on who they're selling to, but the missing human element hasn't made the technology smarter to connect in a way faster before they get to a point of sale and have a more meaningful relationship with the brand. It's why there's so much brand switching, because the focus is transactional. So if this is all I'm going to get out of it, then someone else can give me that too, and I'll go with them. True brand affinity starts with some sort of human element in the center. Until that gets sort of nailed down, that gets into the conversation about really designing for mobile experiences, then you're still going to have technology trying to beat clients up the side of the head and trying to move the needle down the innovation path, and clients fighting because they're going to say, well, how much is it going to cost me? Or they're going to say, well, what does that mean? Can you define it for me first? Or you're going to get your retargeting conversation about, yeah, but I just want them to go to the map. Yeah. So, I think that's sort of still kind of the missing piece in the middle that still has to be massaged so everything kind of can collectively come together.
So one of the things I always think about is, you think about these new data sets and some of the things we're talking about here, enable an opportunity to create, as you're starting to allude to, like a relationship with the consumer that is deeper and wider because you have more data. And one of the observations I always used to have is, and this is a massive generalization, but it seems to me that every 3-4 years, you beat a set of consumers over the head with a whole bunch of advertisements, and then once they bought a car, okay, you're on your own, we'll come back in 3-4 years, and why? So with this observation, why don't we spend more time, effort, and energy on this retention, on saying, hey, you bought a new vehicle, let me tell you about the upgrade to the software, or let me tell you about the fact that you should replace your shocks here, let me sell you parts and accessories instead of retargeting you with ads for the vehicle you already bought. That's obviously a broader question, but I always think of, the DMP reality we're moving into, the mobile reality, this rich data should enable us to have those relationships now. Like, is that happening? Do you and your clients sort of say, let's use these new tools to deepen the relationship with our consumers? Or is it still the old school, just let's hit them up with ads to sell cars?
We're moving in that direction very aggressively. But to your point, it involves getting different stakeholders together in a room to see the collective value. Because oftentimes internally, the people responsible for selling the cars aren't responsible for parts and service. Yeah. And it's kind of inherent on us to bridge that gap. So when we talk DMP with the client, we make sure that anyone who could be involved with, not just prospecting, but the owner life cycle, including parts and services in the room. Absolutely.
What do you guys see, Thomas, Chris? You see any move towards kind of this idea of customer retention and care and feeding of customers through digital channels?
Yeah, there's certainly a need there. I think there's always some level of caution in using CRM for digital activation, right? Whether the caution is related to privacy, as an example, or perhaps all the data points aren't there to be able to assess, okay, we know where they are in terms of their ownership cycle, and we know the lifetime value. And based on that, we're going to make some informed decisions in terms of the messaging and the outreach. So, I think we're starting to have those discussions, but it's going to require us to be a bit more sophisticated, I think, in terms of how we use this as a retention tool. And also, I think, depending on the strength of the brand, perhaps retention is almost taken a bit for granted. If you have a really strong brand, then perhaps you know that you're going to get a good majority of folks coming back, and maybe you don't have to work quite as hard. And really, where you need to invest is going out and acquiring and taking market share that's to be had out there.
Yeah, so I know we're starting to run low on time here, so I think one of the things I wanted to do is maybe go down the line here and sort of two things. like when you think about, so this idea of a bunch of the themes we've touched on, mobile, the opportunity, the sort of horizontal enablement, data, bridging to DMPs, all the things we talked about. What are the things right now that, get you angry, get you frustrated, make you sort of less optimistic? And then I'd love to hear your thoughts on, so what are the really optimistic stuff? What's the stuff that, you guys are charged about? Maybe start, with Scott in terms of, what are your thoughts there as you sort of summarize this for us?
Biggest frustration would be the lack of unification in the marketplace in terms of us all working together to solve client problems. I want to have a round table of trusted partners, and I want them all to work together, and that's harder to achieve than I would like. Biggest element of hope would just be that mobile is going to force us to evolve and be smarter, and I like that I can't be complacent with mobile.
Great.
I don't know what emotion to attach to it, but I think for me, the thought I have is just, I'm tremendously interested in terms of how the Googles and the Facebooks and whoever just that owns such rich data, how ultimately those companies will work together. I think Facebook can kind of get us there. Hey, I laughed right along with you because, I don't know if it's ever going to happen, but, Facebook can almost get us there, right? Providing a very, very comprehensive view, but there's still some holes. And what are those companies or what are those partnerships that are going to kind of complete the picture in terms of, true insights, attribution, all of those things that we talked about. So, as marketers, hopefully we can force those conversations, but obviously they're behemoths, and financially, that's what's really going to drive whether it makes sense for them to go down this partnership path. But yeah.
Well, that's interesting, right? You think about the yin and yang in that one, of which they have so much data, and they have the biggest PII stack out there that's connected to cross-screen and fully deterministic. But I often hear that they don't want to share that data, right? They don't want to send it back to the DMP and CRM. So, your clients can't ingest it and make use of it. Is that the sentiment, or?
Yeah.
So the opportunity, but they're not opening it up, right? So.
Absolutely.
Chris, what are your thoughts?
Probably the biggest frustration through the years has been kind of this notion of kind of just relying on legacy KPIs, just because that's kind of the way we've done it, and the client not driving, like, here's the business objective, and therefore start with a whiteboard. Here are the 3 to 5 KPIs we should have for this campaign or this series of campaigns over the next year for this business objective. And those KPIs should be different depending on what you're trying to do. That it's just mind-boggling to me that isn't more pervasive, and it's such a solvable problem. And I think it's just the clients kind of, I think what's going to be interesting, my hope on the other side of this is the clients now, what typically have been industries that have been brand industries, okay, CPG, auto, parts of high-end retail, everyone's going to start thinking much more like a direct response advertiser, because finally the tools are here to do this. And so the collision of brand and DR will happen, and I think that's a cool thing, because I think the clients can take more ownership and control of their business outcomes from a marketing perspective, and then they can start to drive, rather than just say, okay, kind of here's how much money I want to spend this year on these different media types, and then the agencies lay out the allocations to the right media partners. I just think it can be a much more collaborative environment for the client and the agency and the client to be thinking more about business outcomes, and then therefore what do you want to do downstream. So I'm hopeful we'll get to that.
Great. Albert?
I think my thing would probably be along the lines of people collectively stop looking at mobile as a channel, but start thinking about mobility. And mobility in the sense of the consumer being a forever changing, moving target that's evolving in real time. And what that means in terms of bringing down that understanding. The one thing I want to see is when we get to the point where we collectively start peeling off what certain categories are doing in piecemeal, but not in unison. So if you look at the innovation of the mobile consumer for what fashion houses do, what they do in the apparel industry, probably the most advanced out of any category, to see that come into automotive to redefine the dealer experience per se. To look at, the way credit card companies track fraud in different markets against a credit card number, literally within hours, to say, okay, this doesn't track, and they start pulling information and formulating a profile in real time just through some algorithm. I mean, there are categories that are doing pieces of it for their respective businesses or industries, but no one's put together kind of the future view of what that's going to look like. I mean, I think it's exciting because a lot of it's there. You know, you think about the near-field communication technology devices talking once they get in proximity. Again, certain categories you see it done, but again, not widespread. And no one's brought all the different pieces that all the different categories are doing a little bit of something, flirting with it, to say, well, this is going to be the future view. Let's get all the partners, all the technology companies, the content companies in a room, and let's just go ahead and hammer this thing out. So it's the anticipation of kind of waiting for that moment, that epiphany to come, that it's always been there. Even if we're looking at, you know, military advancement, since everything we get technology-wise is secondhand military, and starting to say, well, what they're doing now is going to be the future of what we're going to be doing at a human consumer level. So let's start to work towards that now. You know, there's a lot of sort of verticals popping up here and there, people making money here and there, but literally, as you talked about breaking down walls, they're all sitting next to each other, but they don't even know they're necessarily there operating next to each other, and that they actually are, at some point are going to need each other. So that would probably be it for me.
That's great. So look, as I think we wrap up here, right, a ton of really great deep thoughts, right? If you were to summarize this, so this idea of mobile, as we talked about, right, it's not a, you know, a silo channel. It is a horizontal enabler. Don't just use it for this sort of blunt instrument of geo-conquesting. Think about what you can learn from mobile, right? Think about the idea of the data and the learnings that it can push back, that can go beyond this idea of just media. Think about creative, right? I think there's a lot of great thoughts there with a lot of work to do. Traditional KPIs that are sometimes challenging. Attribution, mobile provides this new type of attribution, and I think, you know, you think about bridging that to the DMP, you think about mobile as this connective enabler. I always think, right, that mobile to me is really sort of bringing into reality now this long dream of, you know, real, true one-to-one marketing. And as we said, we're going to get there and then it's going to change again, but it is going to be better than it is now. And I think mobile, as this huge sensor network, is going to start to enable that new reality. So with that, thank you very much for all of your thoughts and all of your time. Appreciate it.